From Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and the studios of 850 AM WFTL, this is Outlaw, America's alternative voice. Streaming around the world at outlawshow.com. This week, Help Me Outlaw. We're joined by Broward County's lead public defender, Howard Finkelstein, your host for Outlaw, attorney, political leader, and equal rights activist, Dean Trantalis.
Good evening. My name is Dean Trantalis, and welcome to Outlaw, America's alternative voice. Tonight, our show, we have a very special guest, Howard Finkelstein, a member of the Broward County Bar and the Florida Bar. Welcome, Howard.
Hey, welcome. Thank you for having me.
And we'll get on with our show in just a moment. This is going to be our 8th show. And as we continue the journey into a historic approach to educate, challenge, and provoke listeners into hearing and understanding issues that directly affect members of the gay community, as well as their families, their friends, and co-workers. Outlaw will serve as a new voice, an alternative voice to the messages heard most often in the mainstream media. It will act as an outlet for those voices who cannot otherwise be heard, and through this dialogue, it will hopefully uncover new ways to put an end to injustice and inequality. And if there's somebody in this community and in this world who has striven through his career to put an end to injustice and inequality, it is Howard Finkelstein. Welcome, Howard.
Thank you, Dean.
I asked Howard to be our guest, and he's our only guest tonight, because Howard and I, we met many years ago, probably 25 years ago, when Howard was not the chief public defender, and Howard was practicing law in private practice as a defense attorney. Howard, tell us a little bit about your beginning in the legal profession.
Well, I'm a kid that grew up really in the shadows of the 1960s. And for me, from a very, very early age, I wanted to be the lawyer for poor people. I never wanted to represent corporations, never wanted to represent wealthy people. And for people of my generation, speaking truth to power, standing up to the powerful forces that exist in our community was really what my life's work and life's breath was from a very, very early stage. Went to high school locally, went to college at University of South Florida, went to law school.
You're from this area?
I am from this area since the age of 15.
Okay.
And I took an internship with the Public Defender's Office in the 1970s, and I basically have stayed there for about 30 years.
And you have risen to the level now where you're now the Chief Public Defender for Broward County. Is that officially your title?
That my official title is Public Defender for the 17th Judicial Circuit, and what that goes to prove is if you stay in one place long enough, no matter how good or bad you are, and you get old, eventually they give you a title and more money.
Don't minimize yourself. No. The reality is you have definitely been an important part of the community, and you have definitely helped so many. And that's kind of what this program is about. In the introduction to the program, you heard, and those who are listening have heard, how the gay and lesbian community, the LGBT community, has certainly evolved over time, even within Broward County. And having lived here all these years, you have witnessed it, and you've participated in it. And let me just start out by saying, without making you feel uncomfortable, that the gay community has appreciated all of what you have done to help advance the cause of equal rights, and it's not always the most overt conduct that people see, and it's usually what's behind the scenes, subtle ways in which you have edged this community into a community of tolerance, understanding, and certainly through education. Being an activist myself, I saw a lot of this firsthand, but for those who are new to the community or who weren't really activists, I don't really think a lot of people saw what really used to go on.
People really don't have an understanding, and to be a little bit graphic and dramatic about it, back in the 70s,
when people don't like to be dramatic.
Don't
offend our sensibilities.
When I was a young public defender, and AIDS had just started exploding.
This is in the 80s.
This is actually the late 70s, early 80s. And AIDS is just starting to explode. We don't know anything about the disease, but at the time, it was the gay disease. And they used to take my clients, and they used to dress them up in spacesuits and gloves. They would bring them down the hallway in chains. They would remove everybody everybody from the hallways. They'd remove everybody from the courtrooms. The lawyers wouldn't get near to them. And it was viewed as an extension of someone's gayness. It was one of the darkest moments I have ever seen. And I've seen a lot of dark times here, especially in the South, dealing with African Americans and how they were denied equal rights and dignity. But at that time, there was no organized gay community. When I would try to reach out, there was nobody to reach out to because the gay community was still very shuttered in because they were afraid, and they had every reason to be afraid. In those days, people might not remember, police used to go into gay clubs. They would pull people out on the street with helicopters going over above, taking cameras. The media would be there. They'd be taking identification so they could identify who was gay and who was in a gay bar.
Well, we actually brought that up in our first show. We talked about that. We had one of the club owners, John Castelli, who used to be a co-owner of a club that's now no longer there, called the Copa, which was near the airport. And he reminisced, I guess that's the way to talk about it, he reminisced about the moment in which the sheriff at that time, which was Nick Navarro, undertook raids such as that, just like what you've described, and either through intimidation or actual arrest, attempted to try to demonize the gay community, which was okay at that time.
It was, not only was it okay, people got pleasure out of inflicting pain on people who were gay, and there wasn't like there was a blowback. Here you have a sheriff doing something that was so outrageously wrong, morally, ethically, and legally, and nobody seemed to really care. It was one of the more stunning things I've seen, but it also continued. People forget. They used to arrest people. If you were gay and somebody, and a law enforcement officer or a citizen, would catch you involved in an amorous embrace, kissing, you were arrested for lewd and lascivious behavior. I'm not talking about out-and-out sex in the open. I'm talking about holding hands with somebody that you love. It was very, very dark. And to see where the gay community has come now, where even people who want to be president of the United States of America have to come to Wilton Manors, and they have to kiss the ring. And you know something? It makes my heart feel really good.
Let's get back to what you were talking about, some of the first exposure you had to the discrimination within the gay community, those who were affected by HIV. I think that's certainly what brought the issue of the gay community to the headlines, to the forefront. A lot of people certainly lived their lives as gay people, but it was more closeted, not as exposed as it later became, because HIV now became a national epidemic.
Yes.
And people were afraid. Nobody knew what it was. Nobody knew how it was spread. I remember the first headlines talked about how certain use of, there was an inebriant at that time called poppers, so people thought that's how people got HIV.
Amyl nitrate, but I wouldn't know anything about that.
Right, okay. I mean, it was definitely, even within the gay community, there was that fear, because nobody knew what it was all about. And but certainly the authorities within our community seem to have gone overboard in continuing with the isolation and demonization of people who had HIV.
Well, what people don't remember, every time when I hear politicians talk about how Ronald Reagan was the next closest thing to God himself, I want to remind them that as president, and
You didn't hear me say that.
Right,
Okay.
and forget all of his other policies, forget that.
Right.
Just simply that he stopped the research and development, that single-handedly he was responsible, in my opinion, for the deaths of thousands of people that need not have died.
Because he cut off the funding.
Exactly.
And that was during the 1980s when he was president. And that was at the time when HIV was starting to make its way into the population of the United States.
And during the time, my wife, who's from San Francisco, and we have what we call our family of choice. And it's a group of 5 lesbian couples that we have basically grown up with. During that time, we would get a call almost every single week that another friend of ours had died. I don't think people understand, especially I see how the rate of HIV is climbing again, because this generation doesn't look at AIDS as a death sentence or a life-threatening.
Well, they don't look at HIV as a death sentence. They don't see AIDS as something that's going to interfere with their life's progression.
And that's because, if you're 21 years of age, most people who have AIDS, they can deal with their disease through medications, and we don't see what we were seeing back in the early 80s. As a defense lawyer, when I had a client that was gay and had AIDS, what I did was I just took 2 continuances. They were guaranteed to be dead. Guaranteed. It was almost 100%. There was no treatment. It was one of the worst things I've ever seen, where you'd see these young, good-looking, energized young men walk into a courtroom, and in a matter of months, they were withered to a pulp, and then they were gone.
That seemed to have been the first. That seemed to have been the first moment within the gay community here that I know that I experienced, watching the authorities, that is the law enforcement authorities, as well as the governmental authorities, reacting to people with HIV. And I recall in the 80s there was an incident with Broward County where an individual, a worker, was identified as having HIV, and he was fired. And do you know a little bit about that? Tell us a little bit about that.
I don't know a lot about that, but at the same time, what was happening, I was representing a young woman who had AIDS, and she was arrested for being the AIDS hooker of death. And there were 2. I had one who was an African American, and the other one who was Caucasian. And it wasn't a serious offense. At that time, she was charged with being a prostitute. And that was before we had laws saying that if you know you have AIDS and you have unprotected sex, you could be charged with a serious crime. Well, at the time, she was 7 months pregnant. I got her sober. We went to court. And right after the sentence was imposed of probation so she could take care of her child, I kissed her on the cheek in front of the TV cameras and in front of the courtroom, and there was this gasp, and you could hear it in the courtroom and when they showed it on the news, because at that point, and what if you can get anything across to people, what was so isolating is if you had AIDS, nobody would touch you.
Right.
They wouldn't shake your hand. And imagine being sick. Imagine you're dying. You want the comfort of another human being. And to get a hug when you had AIDS was impossible.
Well, and to some extent, the funding for AIDS research and treatment was probably not a front burner item, if I could be euphemistic, because there was this prejudice and discrimination against it was the gay disease, and this was just a continuation of the discrimination, even though not only gay people were contracting HIV. As we know, children and adults through transfusions, and certainly people from foreign lands were certainly contracting it who were not gay, but it early on became the gay disease.
Yes.
And so to that extent, it became a reasonable and useful tool for those who chose to discriminate to say, well, look, they're diseased, we need to isolate them.
Right. And what people also may not remember is it wasn't just that it was a gay disease. It was a gay disease delivered to gay people by God. And that was the fuel. It was bad enough. All the other stuff was bad. But otherwise good people, in their self-righteousness, felt that it was okay to not only pass judgment, but to condemn and say they deserved it. It was an outrage.
And why? How did the God component become part of this? Maybe I should have asked that to those who are in the religious community. But I mean, how did the God component become part of this? Is it because of the pervasiveness of the disease within the gay community, and then the condemnation by the religious zealots who were looking for a reason to condemn the gay community?
I think it's because people who are fundamentalists, whether you're fundamentalist as a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, when you take the literal words of the various different Bibles, in my opinion, you can get to some very bad and to some sick places. They took a certain line out of the Old Testament, and that the line says that a man who lays with another man commits an abomination. What's amazing about that is, well, then how do you explain lesbians? So that's okay? It apparently, they took that one little phrase, and that became the fuel. And therefore, it was okay for Ronald Reagan to cut off the funding, because after all, these are people that are not God's children. And maybe the pain is well-deserved. And you would see that. It would be on the radio airs. You'd see people on TV talking about it.
It was a disease that was contracted through conduct also.
Yes.
And that conduct was also condemned by religious zealots.
Absolutely. In fact, it took the United States Supreme Court to stop the actual act of sex between two people of the same sex from being a crime. It really wasn't until the Lawrence case out of Texas where they stopped prosecuting people for being gay. It's not unlike back in the 60s when it used to be illegal, a crime, to be an addict. They didn't have to catch you with drugs. If you were addicted to the drugs, that made you a criminal. The Supreme Court had to change that. Well, the same thing happened with being gay. Well, it's okay to be gay, but you better not act on being gay. And if you do act on being gay, it's a crime. And I represented a lot of people, some very big names in our community as well, who were caught kissing someone or involved in a sex act with someone, and they were prosecuted.
Public sex act or private sex act?
It was private.
Private. And so tell us a little bit about how we've come as a community from the 80s into the 90s and now into the new millennium. What are the attitudes?
The attitudes are changing dramatically. I taught high school, too. One of my daughters wanted to go to private school and couldn't afford private school, so I took a job teaching so she could go there. And what was amazing of this young generation is they are much more conservative than you or I are on almost every political issue, except when it comes to equal rights for gays. To them, and they may be, when I tell you, even a right-wing Republican conservative, but they are absolutely adamant that if you're straight, you can get married. If you're gay, you should be able to get married. It's a very interesting anomaly.
So the social culture has evolved.
It has.
Okay.
It has changed so much so that there are three people that I love more in my life than my own life. One of them is my daughter. My daughter's gay. To watch her be able to be free.
How old is she?
She's 23 now.
23. 23?
Yeah, I know. I'm getting old. But to watch her be free and proud is an amazing thing. When I grew up, you didn't even telegraph to people you were Jewish. My girls grow up, they got the Jewish star on, they're so proud to be Jewish, and being gay is just the same thing. She goes out into the world never thinking to even look over her shoulder that someone would be looking at her sideways or differently.
Right.
So
Or in fear.
Or in fear. And to be a young gay person in this community now is a wonderful thing to see, but it's only because of people like you and others like you who paved the way. Because back then, when you were 23, and you were gay, you didn't even have any place to go. There were a couple bars in town, and that was the entire gay community. Was you'd go to a bar and you'd meet somebody just to actually have an act of sex, hopefully.
Or just to meet people that were like you.
Yes.
There was no other place to go because you really didn't self-identify in restaurants or, you would pick people out in a crowd, so to speak, if your gaydar was up,
right.
as we say. And I remember, there's up in Orlando, they used to have when they celebrated Pride in June at the Walt Disney World, the organizers would tell you, well, go to Disney, and they had the beginnings of Gay Disney, and the way you identified another gay person that day was to wear red.
Right.
And this was really like in the late 80s. Now Gay Disney is completely different. It sort of takes over the whole park that weekend. But you'd go around looking for people who were wearing red because you didn't necessarily know who was gay and who wasn't. And there weren't necessarily that many people wearing red, but that was a way to, like, it was a marker.
Right.
So, but down here in Broward County, we have, I guess, experienced and witnessed the change, and it's a tenuous change, because the pendulum swings both ways, and it's always been my belief that in the effort to secure equal rights, whether you're gay, whether you're African American, whether you're of a different faith, tolerance, acceptance, inclusion is a very volatile thing, and even just recently this week with the Florida Family Association condemning that program that broadcasts the day-to-day life of people in the Muslim faith. I mean, I actually saw a clip on that. I saw a clip of the show, and it was actually kind of very mundane and ordinary, and David Caton, our dear friend from the 80s, who was then associated with the American Family Foundation, now it's the Florida Family Foundation, they contend that because it was so everyday looking and so mundane, that it didn't really show what being Muslim was all about, because being Muslim is about being a terrorist. Being Muslim is about having a show that talked about how you create a bomb, and being Muslim is about violence, and this was a whitewash of what Islam is about, and therefore it should not be broadcast on TV. And they convinced Lowe's hardware store, which is amazing.
I saw that, Dean, and what's really amazing is, prejudice, in order for it to exist, you can't really know the people that you hate, because once you meet them, you can't hate them. I have a lot of Muslims that work in my office, and if you came into my office, you couldn't tell me who was Muslim. When you meet their kids, they're hanging out at the mall like my kids. They're going to the same movies. It is really an outrageous thing for any American to do, to cast a whole faith of billions of people. Granted, there are some people within the Muslim community that have hijacked their religion. Really hijacked it.
Well, I think every religion you can point to that.
Absolutely.
Even amongst Jews, you see the extremists who have hijacked the culture and the religion.
Yes.
And Christianity, I don't have to tell you.
Right.
So, and that's the unfortunate thing. And what David Caton was saying was that's the true nature of Islam, the violent nature, and to try to portray it in a different way is trying to deceive Americans, and we let our guard down. Now, when you have people out there talking like that, what it tells me is that there's still the simmering resentment and prejudice despite the outward appearance of inclusion. And within the gay community, even here in Broward County and Fort Lauderdale, yes, the bastions of prejudice like the Coleridge Presbyterian Church and others may have mollified their rhetoric to some extent. Right. And even I understand within their own congregation there's been a huge split, and the more conservative group has gone on to form another church, but that doesn't mean that the elements of prejudice and hate still don't simmer out there. And so that's why I think it's so important that yes, we've made headway in trying to ameliorate the anger and the fear of someone who's different. But like you say, getting to know somebody who you thought you hated is probably the best way to get rid of that prejudice.
When I tell you, not only do I have a lot of Muslims in my office, I have a lot of people gay, lesbian, and
what you let anybody.
Yeah, I let anybody. And you know what you find out? We're all God's children. Right. That the essence of the person who's gay is the same as the essence that's inside of me. That there are no degrees of separation unless we fabricate them. And so if you and I think alike, we kind of live alike, and the only thing that's different is who you are in bed with. Is that big a difference? And the answer, I think, is people sometimes need to feel that they are better than others, and that seems to be the basis of prejudice. I must cast somebody as inferior to me. With gays and lesbians, the fear still exists in me today because it is fueled so much by religious fundamentalists who pull their book up and say, Don't take it up with me, take it up with God. That otherwise normal thinking people seem to think that that is a license to hate. And I always look at those people and say, you believe God is omnipotent, yes? You believe that God is perfect, yes. Well then, you think he made a mistake with 1/10 of the population?
Well, but their response is, you don't have to be gay if you don't want to be, which is the myth which they choose to
Well,
possess.
you know why it's a myth? Being gay or straight is really simple. If you're a guy and a good-looking guy walks by and you find your head turning, chances are you're gay. If a good-looking woman walks by and gets your attention, this isn't a conscious thought process. What you see, if it attracts you, that's what you are. And it is amazing to me that people have this ludicrous thought that it's a choice. Well, I can tell you with my daughter, and I've told you, who I love more than my own life, but being gay is harder than being straight. Why would anybody choose to make their life harder other than that's who they are?
Well, that's often the statements that we make. Why would we want to be discriminated against, thrown out of our homes by our families, shunned by our peers, denied access to jobs and housing and public accommodations? I mean, what is the thrill of that? Just to have sex with someone?
Right. Right. And that's why, when you see people that want to re-educate, and retrain, well, that's what they used to do in communist Russia, re-education camps. You can't re-educate someone that's gay, and besides that, why would you want to?
Well, we say the same, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the government's approach to the gay community here in South Florida, and your experience right after the break. And we'll take a pause, and we'll return in a few moments.